Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Chris Legaspi, and today we are going to continue the Controlling Values series. We're going to do environments and landscapes today. So, thank you for joining me wherever you are. Today, we are coming from our wonderful Discord community. If you are watching live or on replay, comment below. Let me know, where are you located? What time is it for you? I'm currently in Thailand. It's 10 in the morning for me, Saturday morning. Happy holidays to those of you who celebrate holidays. Any Americans watching? Happy Thanksgiving to you. Thank you for being here wherever you are. If you'd like to join us in our brand new Discord, we have a lot of hardworking and talented artists there. Our Discord community is private right now, so I'm going to keep it that way. We want to make sure we only get the hardworking, positive folks here. So all you have to do to join our Discord is to sign up for my insiders email list, and that is totally free. And these lessons and weekly live streams are free. So to take part and join our community, go to drawwithchris.com. And there you can just enter your email. And as soon as you enter your email, you will get the Discord link and links to any live classes. All right, let's talk about environments. And I'm going to share a couple of ideas first that can help you with the values. And then we're going to demonstrate some of the process here. It's a very fun thing to do, and it's a fun way to practice values. Even if you like figures and portraits like me, I'm sure many of you watching are like me. You mostly draw figures and portraits. These skill sets here that we're going to learn today directly apply to the figure. First, we're going to talk about value grouping, value ranges, and local color, and then we'll do some demonstrations. All right, the first concept that really changed my life when I started to learn realism and wanted to become a professional artist, specifically when it came time to putting portfolio pieces together. The one thing that I was always lost about was that when you want to do like realistic shading or realistic color, which is really just tonal, with the complexity of color, the thing that really helped me was the ability to see things in value and specifically see things in value groups. Value grouping, that's the ability to look at, if you're looking at landscape, right, to look at a green and to look at different shades of green, to look at trees and light and trees and shadow and go, you know what? There's a lot of different little things happening in the leaves and all these lights and branches and things and highlights. But you know what? As a visual artist, the most important thing I can do is to group all of those little complexities that I see into shapes of value. So the most important, or the most simplest thing we could do is to group things as either light or dark. So sort of a binary way to think of it, something light, something dark, with environments depending on the complexity of the environment and the lighting, obviously, time of day and things like that. Or if you're looking at photography, the exposure, how the photographer exposes the camera, the film has an effect on the value. But generally, when you look at a scene, let's just talk about a scene in the natural world, things have an inherent value. So you want to be able to kind of distill or group or simplify and ignore details and sort of see the world in the most basic graphic light and dark pattern, light and dark shape. So if we look at this, this is a photo I took around my neighborhood here. And it's obviously in the afternoon with full sun. There's going to be a lot of dark shadows. So it does tend to make things feel pretty dark, especially in the shadow, and especially when you're talking about things that have a dark local color. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But trees, green things, trees, leaves are inherently pretty dark by themselves. In a neutral light, they would be pretty dark. So even though there's beautiful leaves and intricacies and highlights here, our first job is to group what we see into light and dark. And that's what I have here. This is done in Photoshop. And as you can see, we have a very simple two-value idea, something light, something dark, and nothing really in between. So this is a very graphic way to look at the world. But once we can see the world in this most simple way, then we can start to expand our range, and we could do things like gradients and other ways to expand our values, because obviously we're going to need more than two to get some realism and things like that. If we want to, maybe if we want to describe a building, or maybe if we want to describe like a mountain or a rock that has some form to it, eventually we're going to need values as well. And obviously, things in the natural world, they don't have sharp edges like here in this diagram on the right. They're going to have gradation. So of course you're going to need multiple values there. So this instance on the right here is an example of learning to see the world in a very limited three value kind of world. You have dark shapes, you have very bright shapes, in this case, almost pure white. And then you have kind of something in between, The question is, how do you know what to group once you start to expand the values, right? In this sense, if you're just thinking of a graphical, okay, light and dark, it becomes fairly simple to group. Okay, you can say, well, for example, the road. The road has some grays and some browns and some dirt, but you know what? If I squint, overall, it's fairly bright. But then you have things like the shadow on the ground here, right? You're like, oh, what's that? That's not as black as the motorcycle. It's not as dark as this little dark shape of the tree, or even up here, the tree in shadow. But okay, it's definitely not. It's much darker than the street. So you know what? I'm going to group that with the light. But then when you add sophistication, then you have things like, okay, well, I know greens are dark, but this is the green of a grass. Oh boy. So it's darker than the street, but not as dark as the dark trees and shadows. So what do I do with that? Well, in that case, that would be a mid-tone. That would be somewhere in between. So this is a case where you kind of have to compare a little bit, and also design-wise, maybe design-wise, this little patch of green will look better if it's grouped with dark. You could argue it does. I would argue that this middle one, to me, reads a little bit stronger than this one. I personally like strong graphic reads and things, but either way, this is up to you. What's generally in midtone is generally up to you, up to your discretion. You can group a midtone with dark. You can group a midtone with light. So it's up to the ultimate design. But I think in the end, the importance of value grouping is to get that graphic read. Get that graphic read. We want dark things and light things. And then midtone just gives us a little bit more sophistication. But as long as we can maintain the shape read, the graphic read, we'll still be able to communicate whatever it is we want to communicate: trees, vehicles, buildings, and things like that. So value grouping is the first important skill to learn. And then once you can see the most basic value group, then it's deciding on whether midtone shapes, things that don't quite fall between really bright and really dark, how you design and arrange them and group them depending on what you want to communicate in your environment. Okay, here just another couple quick examples. Here on the left, we have a scene that's kind of mostly in a middle value range. So if we squint, right, if you just distill it into light and dark, right, pretty much clearly the brightest thing is the sky. And then all of this stuff kind of lumps into a kind of mid-tony, dark mid-tone shape. Obviously, you're going to want to show the house. You're going to want to show some form, right? The roof structures, some of the windows, the underplanes, and things like that. And obviously, these big bushy trees and big bushy canopies of trees, they have a little bit of form, kind of like Monet's haystacks, to basically lumps of organic things, but they do have form. So we're going to need a third value. And here, in this case, you can see we have a clear light. We have a clear light, which is the sky. We have a clear midtone, which is everything, pretty much everything in between, or everything in the midground and the foreground bushes and stuff, and then midground trees and house. And then the darks actually give us underplanes, shadow planes, and separation. So look at here. You see this zone? You see that line? That line is a conscious separation of a dark shaped thing, which is a bunch of trees in the background, and a mid-tone shaped thing, which is the house, obviously. And same here. You see this here? This is the part of the house right here. The part of the house that is in shadow versus the side plane of the house, which is it's not quite in light, but it's lighter plane. So you can see that line is also separation of two planes. So again, describing form. Same with, see that little chunk right there? That is basically the underplane of a bunch of leaves, a bunch of bushy thingies. Same here. So in this case, a very strong graphic value grouping would accomplish something. It'll say, okay, stuff, we have stuff in the foreground and we have a sky. That's basically what you're saying. So in this case, the third value, adding a midtone and a dark, basically adding darks to our midtone, gives us a lot of sophistication. A lot of sophistication. So you can see how we can get a lot of work done by very intelligently using the third value, expanding our value range when we need to. Here on the right, we have a little urban scene here. Really, if you squint a lot and you just do a two value analysis, two value groups, really a lot of this will get lost. The only bright thing really is the sky peeking through and this highlight on the window and a couple small little shapes. And maybe a gradation, right? Some of these bricks you can call out. So that would be a very, very, we won't have a lot to work with. We won't be describing much, right? We basically see like a dark thing with a couple light shapes. So once we add, again, the midtone, so now we have a light area, which is at the top with a couple light shaped objects, the window and some bricks. Now we have the ability with midtone and dark to show a little bit more information, right? We can see the doorway, we can see the side plane here, underplane of these steps. So a lot of that is helping us to communicate more information, but still, right? We're still very manageable. Three values, very manageable. So, these decisions, again, we can, like the top plane of the leaves, we can call out the third value, the midtone, to show top plane. We can use the dark to show the side plane of this staircase. We can use the dark to show the underplane of this doorway. We can use the dark to show the door in shadow, and the midtone to call out the door in light. So all of this looks quite complex, but remember before, it's really just training your eye to see very, very graphic shapes, groups of value shapes. Okay, the next thing we have to pay attention to is the value range. Now, unlike indoor figures and portraits and things, the natural world, when you go outside in natural light, generally things don't have a full pure white, pure black value range like we can accomplish with our materials or with Photoshop and things like that, with paint or with charcoals and things, our drawing mediums. Generally, things in the natural world really don't go to black, especially in the daytime. In most daylight situations, things don't go to black. Now they can go to very, very bright. Obviously, things that have bright local color in bright daylight, like the clouds, for example, or even if you're just looking at the hot spot of the sun, or even a white piece of concrete or white stone or snow in daylight is going to get it's going to reach pure white. But in daylight, we don't get pure blacks. I mean, of course, the exception is when you look at photography, because photography has exposure. It's a camera. It's a camera, and with a computer, and it pushes contrast by nature. And also the photography can be an artist and push the contrast too. So you don't really see pure blacks unless you look in the daytime. The exception is anything man-made. So photography or man-made painted object like a black car or a red object like a red car or red building in shadow is probably going to go to very, very, very dark or black. Now, the only exception in the natural world, of course, is at night. At night, obviously, things go to black because there's just not enough light. But in the natural world, no, we have lots of, especially when we're talking about natural light in a natural setting with your own eyes, lots of bounce light just gets everywhere. It just gets everywhere. So it's always brings up the value of the darks. So natural light, things don't go dark, but they can get really white. And exception, of course, at night, if you're doing nighttime scenes or scenes where the sun is about to go down, sunset, sunrise, and things like that, and man-made objects, obviously, things can go to black. And if you look at the natural world through your own eyes with diffused light, so cloudy day, overcast day, right? If you're in like a cold climate, like in Scandinavia or something, where it's always gray, or Seattle or San Francisco or something like that, it's always gray. You don't get a lot of sun, you're going to get very muted values that are close together. You're for sure not going to get black at all. So let's just quickly do a quick value analysis. So this example here, on the left, we have urban scene, and it gets really, really bright. In fact, it gets to pure white. A, because it's a photograph, and B, because we have white clouds with a bright, hot sun. So it gets really bright. But how dark it gets, probably we could all see the darkest area is in shadow, right? This building is a dark, it's made of orange bricks, orange stones, which have a fairly dark local color. But in shadow, it gets really, really dark. So I wouldn't say it gets to pure black, but it gets pretty close. And then midtone, pretty much everything, right, is a midtone. We know about value grouping. So we have a nice range of midtones here. We have darks, middle, light. So it gets pretty full value range. Okay, in this middle example, it's overcast day. We really don't have any pure whites. You guys see that? Not even the clouds, not even the buildings, the white paint on the buildings, these light colored buildings. Not much. It gets pretty bright, but not quite bright. So I would say the brightest thing. What do you guys think? Comment below. What's the brightest thing? I would say it's definitely these buildings, these man-made, hand-colored buildings. So they would get somewhere around there. Now, what's the darkest thing? The darkest thing is, again, the buildings that have a little bit of underplane, right? This little edge of the riverbank here, or whatever this is, this lake, this man-made thing underneath here, that's a shadow. So that gets pretty dark. But it's not quite black, and I'm not going to make it black by any means, but it gets pretty dark. So we're about there. And then midtone, basically everything else kind of groups into a midtone. So you can see the value range here is quite narrow. It's pretty narrow. It's quite limited. Now on the right, the nighttime scene, obviously we're going to pure black here. We're going really dark here. Lots of darks and midtones, and really the only bright thing is the street light. Now the street light is a man-made light. So the hot spot, right, it's going to get pretty bright. But I'm going to sort of keep it in this range. So as you can see, what's happening here, right? We have a nice set of value groups. Again, sort of what we talked about before. But once you understand different lighting, you can say, okay, if you have a night scene, I know, okay, my values are going to be pretty dark. I'm not going to go to pure white unless I want to create something that feels man-made. If I'm doing a daytime scene, outdoor daytime scene, most of the thing is going to be fairly in the midtones to dark midtones. My darks will only get dark if there are shadow shapes, so I can describe planes and areas of shadow. And my brights will only get bright if I have bright colored things in full sunlight. So clouds and light colored objects. And then in our midtone world, everything is pretty much has a very narrow group. So I know if I'm doing an overcast scene, I know, okay, my lightest light won't get that bright. My darkest dark for sure won't get that dark. And most of the work will be done in the midtone. So I'm really going to have to be very sophisticated when it comes to my gradations and value groups in the midtone. This is something to keep in mind when you are trying to compose your scene. Pay attention to the lighting, time of day, and then that will help you to define your value range, or vice versa. Your value range will describe to the viewer the time of day and the weather that you're trying to describe. Okay, and one last thing in value range is that we know that in general, typically in outdoor settings, the brightest thing will be the sky, the darkest things will be dark colored objects or things in shadow. But in terms of depth, one of the things to consider in value is the atmosphere. Generally, the atmosphere will tend, atmosphere being the mist, the oxygen, the dirt, uh, maybe fog or things in the air, in the atmosphere, they generally tend to lighten the value of things. So that means the more atmosphere you have, meaning something's farther away, the more atmosphere you have between you and the thing and the object, it will generally get lighter. So as something gets further away, there's more atmosphere in the way between you and the thing, it will generally get lighter, and vice versa. As things get closer to you, they obviously get sharper in detail and contrast, but you maintain the inherent value of it. So if something is dark or if something is in shadow and it's close to you, it's going to appear to have its inherent darkness. So atmosphere, this image on the left is just a very clear-cut example of atmosphere. If you notice, as these layers of mountains and things get further away, they get lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter, right? And vice versa. As you get closer to the foreground, right from top to bottom, in this case, right, the darkest things are in the foreground. These trees, which are very dark, dark green trees, the inherent value of dark green tree is quite dark. And as you can see, as it's closer, it's really dark. Now, these same trees are here. You guys see that? These same trees are in this group of mountains and things, but obviously they're much, much, much brighter in value. These same trees are also here. These same trees are also way back here, but obviously much more atmosphere in between. So atmosphere has an effect on value. And therefore, if you want to make something appear like it's further away, guess what value will serve that purpose? Lighter values. If you want something to appear closer to you, generally, if you want it to come forward, make it dark. Generally, obviously, if you're going to put a white cube or something like a white-skinned model in a white fabric, obviously that's an exception to the rule. But generally, dark things will come forward. Like look at this cow. This cow obviously is in shadow too, but this cow is not really that dark. It's a brown, but it's local color wise not that dark. It has a black collar, dark gray collar, and look how dark the collar gets as it comes forward. Makes it come forward. This effect is a naturally occurring effect, and we could also amplify it. This image here is from a movie I just recently saw called Coma. Comment below if you've seen it. Coma, C-O-M-A. I just started watching it. It's fantastic. But the reason why I wanted to call attention to this screen capture is notice the value structure and the atmosphere. Look at what's really dark. What's really dark? Comment below, right? Everything in the foreground is really dark. Even the character's armpit, the character's hair, the shadow of the character, this lamppost, which is already, it's a black object basically, and this dark, dark, dark railing, this building. Look at really, really dark. And what's really bright? What's really bright is the distant, distant sky. And then as you get closer, right, it gets a little darker. As you get closer, a little darker. As you get closer again, a little darker, and then boom, once you get to the foreground, darks and almost pure blacks. It's exactly the same value structure, value design happening here in this photograph. But this is amplified by an artist. This is a photographer, a cinematographer, amplified that effect to push the feeling of depth, push the feeling of atmosphere. We can use this sense of atmosphere to push things back and to bring things forward. Okay, the next idea to become familiar with is local color and the value of things. So obviously the natural world is a colorful world. Landscapes are colorful and beautiful. Even man-made things, houses, buildings, and things, they have inherent color. So we have to be aware that colors have an inherent value. What do I mean by that? Well, this diagram here on the left is from James Gurney, his book, Color and Light. Comment below if you have this book or you're familiar with James Gurney or you read his blog or YouTube. It's an excellent book, excellent book, highly recommend it. And in his book, he did these swatches of the primaries, yellow, red, and blue, just to show that colors at their most pure or saturated state have an inherent place on the value scale. For example, yellows, right? Pure saturated yellows, like the yellows that we know as yellow, pretty much these up top here. Look at the value, they're pretty bright. And then the reds, and that would include oranges as well. right? The purest red tends to be somewhere in the midtone. You guys see that, right? Pure red. If you go lighter, it gets to pink. It's not pure saturated red. If you go darker, it turns into like this maroon and wine colors. So that's not pure red. So they they get darker, but the red in its purest form is kind of in the middle. And if you notice blues, I would say this is ultramarine blue, I think. So it's a reddish blue, it's a blue violet. And blues and violets are really, really, really dark. Also greens. Greens belong here as well. And we'll look at that in a minute. So if you notice the blues and the violets at its purest state, they're pretty dark. They're in the dark midtones and almost well not black, but very, 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 very dark. So what does that mean? That means when we look at the natural world, when we go to either paint or draw or sketch our environments, or if we want to invent environments, we have to know that when we make something a color, when we assign a color to our drawings and our paintings, we have to be aware that they're going to affect the value if we want that color to be saturated. So for example, let's look at this indoor scene up here, this little indoor scene. You can see a beautiful light coming through here, and look at all of the beautiful colors. We have a fairly yellowy, bright scene. Fairly bright. I mean, it's indoor, so there's going to be shadows and man-made things like this room. But if you notice, right, look at the yellows. They're very, very, very bright. They're very bright. So these yellows be somewhere in this range or in this range, but fairly, fairly bright. If we look at this scene at the bottom, now these are man-made things, but you notice the reds. The reds are pretty dang dark. Notice this red has a little bit of shadow. Even the red in light, the fence, if you squint, it's a fairly, well, it's a midtone, right? It's right here. It's kind of in the middle. But the dark reds, or the reds in shadow, they get really, really dark. So we have to be aware of that. Up here on the right, we have violet. So the sunrise uh, or sunset, it looks like a sunset, has beautiful, beautiful oranges and violets in the sky, right? And then reflected into the water. Even these blue flowers in the foreground, if you squint, they're really dark. They're really dark. They merge with the value shape. Remember grouping of values? So when we take colors, we want to look at a group, we want to look at a shape of color and go, okay, what value is it? Well, it's mostly this color, so I'm mostly this color and mostly this value, so I'm going to group it at that value. And you can see that the blue groups with the green and value-wise, and you can see it's fairly, fairly dark. So and because it's almost nighttime, things get really, really dark in the shadow. And even the sky, normally the sky is very, very, very bright, right? It's in these ranges, these bluey ranges here on the diagram. But as it gets to violet and as the sun starts to go down, again, it gets really dark into the dark midtones. So blues and violets. And finally, our good friend green. Now, um, green obviously there's a range of greens, right? Leaves, grasses, different plants, flowers, different states of leaves, right? We have light leaves. We have these darker, thicker leaves over here. We have older leaves that are sort of this gray. So there's a whole range of green, but in general, green at its purest state, it's pretty damn dark. Pure, I mean high, high, high saturation. So if you look at this green on the lower left, the most intense greens are here and here. And if you squint, man, it is really dark. And the moment you put green in any kind of shadow, it goes absolutely dark, 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 dark. So green is a dark, local colored thing. So that is something we have to be aware of when we add green to our world, or if we want to design an environment that has greens. And obviously, as greens get into light, they can get fairly bright. But in general, even greens and light do not get that bright. So we want to maintain the darkness when we're painting scenes that have a lot of green. All right, now let's get to the fun part. Let's do a little draw along together. So, tools and techniques. The first tool is the value grouping, obviously. And one thing, if you want to practice, is to start with a scene that's easy. So start with a scene that's easy, one that you can see a clear value structure and clear foreground, middle ground, background structure. It's always helpful. So if you look at this, we have clearly, right, if we all squint at this, you can clearly see a very, very, very dark, 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 right? Very, very dark thing. Foreground thing is, in this case, it's the foreground, right? The tree, the branches, the grass in the foreground, very dark. We have clear lights, right? The man-made thing, the the trees and lights. We don't nothing the rock. Nothing goes to pure white. Even the this white is not pure white, but you can see that we have a clear, dark set of things, dark shapes, clear light shapes. That means everything else going to be somewhere in between. So that's going to be up to us to interpret. But if you have a clear light and dark, you know that it'll help make your decisions a lot easier, and you can focus on other things like the details and gradations and the design and the grouping. So even if you're inventing, I would say, especially if you're inventing a composition, it's good to define a clear structure for yourself. And then we have a clear mid-ground thing, clear house. Some light colored things. So start with what's obvious. Obviously, the trees and the foreground bushes and some of the leaves are pretty dark. So let's do that now. Okay, let's start with what's obvious. Start with the darks. If I'm doing this traditionally, I normally do this with a marker just to block in. If I'm doing like uh, proper painting, I would also block in this shape with with a dark pass of paint. So I have some decision making to do, but let's ignore that for now. Up here, these foreground leaves. All right, so what else is dark? Now, I have my big foreground shape. While I have my marker out, I'm gonna just go ahead and block in some more of something that is obviously dark. And I would say for sure the where the water is, right here, there's some shadow shapes of these bushes and things as they go into the water under the bridge downtown. Little bridge shapey things. That looks terrible. So here's where the shape design helps, and then the under the building. So little tiny shapes there, and let's go ahead and block in the door, the underside of the house. Now it's not pure, it's not as dark as the foreground, but I want it there for contrast reasons. So that's a design choice. Remember value grouping. So right now I'm just kind of grouping, I'm taking a look at what's really dark and I'm say, you know what, I'm gonna lump that in with dark things. So that, let me just go ahead and do that now. Dark, 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 and then the trees, the leaves. I'm just gonna go ahead and not be super graphic, but kind of apply my marks in this sort of textural way. So this kind of suggests tree texture and things like that. So that's more of a technique thing, but it is nice. It does tend to lighten the shape because the value of what's underneath will come through. So that's really nice. In this case, there's lighter trees and things underneath. So now you see this shape already. I know I have to edit it because it looks a little strange. It doesn't really communicate what I want, which is a roof with the thingy on top, the long pointy thing on top. So although I'm justified value-wise to group it with darks, it is very dark, this little patch shape. I just have to redraw the shape to make sure that the shape kind of reads better. That's not that much better, actually. But for the sake of time, I'm gonna go through this quickly. Every time I think, okay, I'm gonna try to keep it within half an hour. That never happens. All right. And little nuggets of detail if I want, just to add some variety to my line work and also add some depth. I really like working with fat, wedgy shape, flat shape things. My favorite marker is the Prismacolor marker that has a chisel end. It's like a big fat, it looks like that. Oh, I love the chisel end of things. So that's my favorite tool for doing these environment comps. Okay, next, pure white, or what's really bright? Well, obviously, let's just start with what's obvious. Obviously, this little rock thing, and that's way too bright. This hand painted part of the house thingy, and that's really it. In fact, I'm gonna lighten that a little bit. It's a little too bright for my taste. And then a little bit of this rim light, but I'm gonna need a gradation for that. Now what I'm doing is, okay, I have mostly a mid-tone world with some nice dark things. So now what I'm trying to do is, where can I strategically add light shapes to help me improve my read, help me improve the read of the house, the planes, the texture, the top plane of the trees, if any. Really not much, not much. So very minimal white in this case. And I'm gonna have to obviously switch to an airbrush soon to get the gradations that I need. But for now, especially in this roof, for now I can kind of sketch a gradation with hatching, which looks kind of nice. I don't mind. Okay, I darkened the background over my paper here. I just put a wash of a dark midtone. So I'm pretty much happy with my graphic value structure. Remember, the first thing to do is group the values. So I grouped the darks. I grouped the lights as best as I could. We don't have many lights to work with, but I have a whole bunch of midtone to work with. So now we have a decent read. We have like we have a tree and some things, some bushes and things. We can see that. We have kind of something in the middle. So now what I need to do now is definitely add gradations so I know, can add a little bit more form and detail and sophistication. So I'm going to start with the midtones, keep everything in the darks pretty graphic and flat. So here I have a little gradations. This is the midtone that I'm working with. This will be a slightly darker version, so I'm going to gradate with that. Sort of describe the underplanes of things, the side plane of the house, underplane of the little house. The water definitely has a gradation. And up here, this is all foreground, so that can also be fairly dark. It starts to read. A little bit of gradation there behind the house there. And then now I can add the lighter gradation to show the top plane. So remember, sometimes we need to add gradations to show form, value variation to show form. So only the top planes are going to get this value. That's one way to control the value to make it consistent. So I got to be very careful, right? Can't just put this lighter gray everywhere. I have to reserve it for what I want to read as top plane. And yeah, it's okay. I think I need one more, which is the gradation of dark. I think what I really need is more it's more texture, more different types of brushes and things to show some detail. All right, we have, okay, so we have a nice start of of a tonal drawing here, or a little tonal painting. And then let me add gradation to this house. Okay, could still use some work, but you can see the value structure is there. Now all I need to do, if I want to add sophistication and rendering, is to work within these shapes now. So let's start with the tree. So here I have this value of the tree. So I can just go to a slightly lighter version of it and just add a couple of indications of detail, accents, random, you know, shapes in the wood, random up planes and things like that. So this will give me a chance. This is a little too bright right now, in my opinion. See, as long as you stay close within the value range of the shape that you established and the value structure you established, right? Right now in this world that I just created, foreground things are dark and green things in shadows are dark. Everything else is kind of up for interpretation, but you see, once you have a clear structure, taking it further is fairly simple. You just maintain the value structure you have or adjust the value structure you have. It's not reading like the house, right? The house just looks really wonky. I'll get to that in a minute. Right, so we have dark things, we have a couple of little detail passes, and obviously I can use different brush. Right now I'm just using the kind of the same brush. If you're doing digital, you can get different brushes that look like leaves or wood or whatever. If you're using charcoal or traditional medium, you could change to a different tool. You can use like a toothbrush or something to get ink splatter or whatever. Just ways to get different texture. So that's another thing I could do. And then you also can correct or adjust your value structure. See, I know that that was a little too, right now the house is not reading as well as I'd like. Now it's starting to read. You see that? Sort of adjusted the value. The bright's got a little too bright. The bright's got way too bright. They look very unnatural. And well, it just needs a lot of detail in general. It's obviously it's a man-made thing, so it's going to need some attention for it to read like a complex man-made thing. Going to need to add a little bit of detail and do proper perspective drawing and things like that for these man-made objects. But you see that now it's starting to sit nicely in the environment. Some of these lights were way too bright. Some of these darks are way too dark, I think. So all this needs to be adjusted. But I know because I set up my original value structure, essentially 3 values, dark things in the foreground and in shadow, light things that receive light from the sky dome above, and everything else. Everything else can be adjusted, shifted, interpreted in the mid-tone. So you can keep going. It clearly needs lots of some work and texture. You know, I'm trying to rush for the sake of time. But that's essentially the process of using value groups. Let's do one more example. Okay, let's do an urban scene, again in natural light. This looks like somewhere in Europe, maybe Italy. I normally draw these things very small, but right now on my computer screen, the screen is full size for this recording. Trying to make a full size screen recording. It's just it's a little confusing, to be honest. I'm not used to looking at something so big. I tend to work very, I'm sure you know, work graphic at first. So I pull away, I look at things from a distance. So I start very small, like thumbnail. That's why some of this just looks off to me. Okay, here's my little sketch. Now, what's the darkest thing? Well, the darkest thing is this little cat. I don't know if you guys can see it. This little cat right here. This cat has black fur. Besides the cat is probably this black thing. Well, that's not really black either. Maybe some of these shadows, these green things in shadows, and some of these shadows here in the background. And the brightest thing is very obvious. It's the sky and the white light colored stone in direct light. So really what we have is a fairly mid-tone composition, fairly mid-tone world. So that's what I'm going to do. So I have a fairly mid-tone world. So I'm just going to group. Remember, value grouping is probably one of the most important steps. Recognizing, well, I don't have many darks, but I got a lot of mid-tone and I got an obvious bright. So I'm going to do that. And that is pretty much the value structure. Now, obviously, we need to add detail. So let's do that now. I'm going to add a couple gradations in my mid-tone shape first. There's a couple things that are fairly bright, and I want them to, well, not bright, but they're receiving light. So obviously the side of this building, this thing right here. So I want to make note of that, this side plane. There's a little light shape here, basically a cast shadow here. I think that's a cast shadow, yeah. So lots of brightness, and obviously the texture would help too. You know, this not it's not the most ideal texture. It's a little airbrush texture, and just random light shapes. Now gradations of dark shapes. So as long as I keep them within this kind of mid-tone zone, they don't go too far into light or too far into halftone, I'll maintain that value group that I want. I'll maintain that clear communication of form and space, that we have a mid-tone world with a mid-tone sort of lighting scheme with only a few things that are in shadow or that are really dark, but they're not that dark. And then the stairs, choom, choom. This dark green plant, this dark green plant. Just gradate that for now. A couple little accents and things in here. Little textures and details, and not that important yet, but I just want to make it clear. Boom, 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 boom. So you can see that looks really nice right there. And we're starting to get somewhere, right? Don't have much. We just basically have a big blob of value, but we're starting to get somewhere. We're seeing some space. We're seeing a big kind of foreground-ish object here. We have this another object here. We can see a road or some kind of path, right? And if we add even more detail, you know, it'll look even more closer to what we need. But all we're really doing is grouping the values and then assigning gradients to create sophistication and to show some of the naturalism, right? Some of these things are darker. Oh, there's a whole cast shadow thing right there, actually. So let's find that cast shadow. This cast shadow looks very strange. Okay, so I kind of lost. I lost some of that read. There it is. I made too much busyness and noise right here. Instead of, you know, suggesting things, I just added lots of busyness and it looked terrible. So when you go back to the simpler statement, it often reads much better. And then let's see, there's a couple of, yeah, the sky, excuse me, these mountains in the background here. They're clearly not pure white. They have some value to them. So that's looking pretty good right there. And that's really it. Now we just, you know, let's add detail. And that starts with let's look for, well, we got to refine some shapes. So let's do that now. So I got my value structure pretty good now, right? It reads quite well. Got dark things, we've got light things, we got sky, we got foreground, we got background, we got midground. Now it's just a matter of adding and refining our shapes. Really, that's really all that's left of the detail, is because the value structure is pretty much done, because I grouped everything so well. Everything, all the midtones read as a thing, in this case, buildings. All the darks read as little accents in shadow. The lights read as sky. So we created a set of rules here by doing a value grouping. What's light is sky. What's dark is shadow. What's midtone is pretty much everything else. So it's just a matter of refining shapes, adding some detail shapes, doors, stone, texture, all of that stuff that I'm not going to do here on camera. It's going to take forever. But none of that will look good. It won't look like a brick wall if the values are all messed up. The values are all over the place, right? If you tried to do the spotty, untrained copy method, which is, okay, I got a value here, I got a value here. Oh, 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 there's a bright here, oh, oh, there's a thing there. Oh. Right, that's the thing that I always rant about. I'm sure you guys heard that many times. Is I always rant about the blind copying. That's kind of why I talk so much about design. The whole year, if you think about the whole year, 2021, I have every live stream I've done is related to design in some way. Value design, shape analysis, because if you can design the world to fit your needs, you have a lot of control. And you can make any picture you want and say, more importantly, you can say whatever it is you need to say very clearly if you use good design choices, versus if you just try to copy what you see, which often ends up in a disaster. And I'm guilty of that too. You just saw me do it. You just saw me do it 5 minutes ago with this cast shadow. Bum, 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 bum. Plants. You can even refine the lights. You can say, you know what, I want this to go brighter. I want some of the reflections in the window to come through. I want some of them to be bright. Da 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 da. Some texture. Da 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 da. I want some texture, some door frame. I want this plant to be bigger. Or maybe, you know what? Maybe I want flowers. Maybe I want flowers in my plants. As long as I don't make them too bright, they can still read as like white flowers. That's something you could totally do. I want some of this. I want some of this stone to read as very light stone. So you can do that. You can you can really brighten a highlight. You say, you know what? I want this to be a really nice hot spot. right here. So I'm going to make this a hotspot. Not all of it, just a couple accents to show texture and value. So you see a lot of this is both design, interpretation, and explanation. So that's the goal, that's the balance. But if you keep everything simplified into value shapes, groups, value groups, you add detail within those shapes, as long as they're within the value grouping, right? As long as these detail shapes I'm adding now in these buildings, they don't get too dark, that they break the shape, they break the illusion, that they break the simplicity of the value group that I've established. They're not too bright, then they will read much stronger, and the value will be correct relative to what you have already established. And that's what we're doing here. We are designing a world based on what we see, or we're looking at what we see and we're designing a world. We're designing a world that communicates what we want, urban scene, and we're doing it by limiting and controlling our choices of values and how we apply them. So that's really about it. It's all we have to do now. Right? The values are there, right? As long as we don't go too dark, like this right here, this, as long as that doesn't get too dark, we're good. This little shadow of a doorway, we're good. As long as this little shadow here doesn't get too dark and break the silhouette, we're good. We can pretty much get away with whatever we want, design whatever we want. You know, as long as these brights right here, yes, they're pretty bright, but as long as they don't get as bright as the background, which we established in this world, the brightest bright is the sky, is the background. So that will right now it's a little bright. It's a little too bright, so we got to knock it back. See, it starts to look better. It looks more real once the value structure is reined in, maintained. And then also to remember atmosphere. One last thing about atmosphere, we know that we have darks here, right? Darks in the door. We have darks in this door. We have darks in this plant, but we also have darks here. Dark building, dark doorway, dark detail, right? Dark roof. We know from atmosphere that technically in a neutral light, in a controlled light, these are pretty much the same value. This dark wood of this window, this dark doorway in shadow, this dark doorway, this little crack. This is the same value as this, but we know from atmosphere, that we can push, we can design. So this is design here. I am consciously making things that should be the same value. I'm consciously making them brighter to push the effect of atmosphere. Because now these darks here feel like they're further away because I consciously made them darker. And then these darks here, now they kind of consciously closer to you because I'm exaggerating their value here to bring them closer to you. But you see, that is applying what we learned about atmosphere, and it's also controlling the value.